The precise click of the date stamp against the parchment was the loudest sound in the room, a sharp punctuation mark in the otherwise suffocating silence. I pressed down, the ink bleeding slightly into the fibrous paper, recording another century-old transaction, another forgotten name. My existence, for the past 12 years, had been defined by such moments, meticulous, repetitive, devoid of surprise. Each day, the same journey through the city's gray arteries, the same ascent to the hushed, climate-controlled chambers of the city archives, the same careful handling of brittle documents. My fingers, stained faintly with ancient dust, traced faded script, linking me to lives long extinguished, yet utterly disconnected from my own. I was Thomas, an archivist, and that I often thought was the entirety of my story. The air in the vault was thick with the scent of aged paper, dry rot, and a faint, metallic tang I could never quite place. It was a smell that had become as familiar as my own breath, a constant companion in my solitary work. Sometimes, when the silence stretched too thin, when the fluorescent hum above became a drone in my skull, my mind would conjure images far removed from the orderly stacks around me. A brief, unsettling flash of fluorescent white, the antiseptic reek of disinfectant struggling against something fouler, the low, guttural moan of a man strapped to a cot. A prison hospital ward at midnight, stark and desolate, its shadows long and hungry. I'd seen the records, processed the grim inventories, and though I'd never set foot in such a place, the impression it left on my psyche was as vivid as any lived experience. It was a jarring counterpoint to my quiet, dusty world, a reminder of the raw, untamed horrors that existed beyond my meticulous ledgers. And it was these occasional, unwelcome intrusions that fueled a quiet, insistent yearning within me, a desperate desire for something else. Anything to break the monotony, to dislodge the feeling of being perpetually suspended in amber. Then a brown envelope arrived, not through the internal mail chute, but from the outside, addressed to me personally. A solicitor's crest, embossed in gold, sat heavy on the flap. My heart, a muscle I usually considered merely a biological necessity, gave a faint, unexpected tremor. I slid it open with the same precision I applied to ancient scrolls, careful not to tear the contents. Inside, a formal letter, crisp and officious, informed me of the passing of my grandfather, a man I had not seen nor truly thought of since I was a small child. He had been a phantom, a name whispered in hushed tones by my mother before she too became a ghost of the past. The letter went on, stating with dispassionate legality that I was his sole inheritor. My breath hitched. Not just property, not just a sum of money, but Blackwood Manor. The name resonated, a forgotten chord struck in the deepest part of my memory. Now it was mine. I spent the next few days in a fog, my archival duties performed on autopilot. Every break, every spare moment was dedicated to searching for Blackwood Manor. It wasn't in any recent land registry, nor in the city's modern maps. Only by digging into older, more obscure regional records did I find it. A sprawling estate deep within the Blackwood forest, miles from the nearest paved road. Isolated, forgotten. It looked less like a home and more like a sentinel standing guard over some profound secret. The more I learned, the stronger the pull became. My life here was a slow fade, a gradual erasure. Blackwood Manor, by contrast, pulsed with an unspoken history, an enigma waiting to be solved. My grandfather had been an eccentric, a recluse, a man whose life was as opaque to me as the faded ink on a medieval manuscript. This inheritance wasn't just property. It was a key, a chance to unlock not only a physical place but a lineage, a personal history I had been denied. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. I notified my supervisor, packed the meager belongings of my sterile existence into a handful of boxes, and made arrangements to leave. There was no farewell party, no tearful goodbyes. My colleagues, if they noticed my absence at all, would simply find another set of hands to stamp documents. The journey was long, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to a deeply rutted dirt track that wound deeper and deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser with every mile, their gnarled branches reaching across the track, forming a perpetual twilight even in the afternoon sun. Finally, as dusk began to bleed purple into the sky, I saw it. Looming above the ancient tree line, a silhouette against the fading light, Blackwood Manor. It was larger, more formidable than the old photographs suggested, a relic from another age, untouched by the passage of time. This wasn't just a house, it was a presence. And this story, I knew, was just beginning. My existence in that dim archive had been a series of such clicks, a meticulous accounting of lives long past, entirely divorced from my own. But that was before Blackwood Manor. The estate lawyer's key, cold and heavy in my palm, had been the first tangible proof of my new reality. Moving into the manor was not merely a change of address, it was an excavation. Every dust-sheeted piece of furniture, every cobwebbed portrait, represented a layer of a history I knew nothing about. My grandfather, a man I'd only ever known through faded photographs and the occasional clipped anecdote from my distant mother, had left me everything. And everything, I quickly learned, was too much. My first week was a blur of inventory. I approached the manor like I would a new collection in the archive, systematically. I started with the ground floor, working my way through the drawing room, the grand dining hall, the cavernous kitchen, meticulously noting cracked porcelain, moth-eaten tapestries, and the pervasive scent of aged wood and damp. One afternoon, while attempting to catalog the contents of a vast, unlit library, I heard it. A faint scraping sound like fingernails dragging across coarse stone from somewhere above me. I froze, a leather-bound volume of forgotten poetry still clutched in my hand. The sound was too subtle to be the house settling, too deliberate to be a rodent. I told myself it was the wind, a branch against a window, anything but what my gut insisted it was. Something moving within the manor, something not me. I spent the next few days in the upper floors, driven by a determination that bordered on obsession. The second story held the bedrooms, each one a relic of a bygone era, heavy with the scent of lavender and disuse. My breath plumed faintly in the air, even on a mild autumn day. I found a child's rocking horse in one room, its painted eyes staring blankly at the wall, its runners worn smooth. I distinctly remembered placing it facing the window earlier that morning. Now it was turned inwards towards the bed. A tremor went through me. I blamed my own forgetfulness, my mind playing tricks in the isolation. The scraping sound returned, stronger this time, emanating from the third floor. My grandfather's study, I knew, was up there, along with a few guest rooms I hadn't yet dared to explore. The staircase to the third floor was narrower, steeper, the wood groaning beneath my weight like an old man complaining. I methodically checked each door. Most were locked, their brass handles tarnished black. One, however, yielded with a soft click. The room beyond was unlike any other I had seen in the manor. It was a long, narrow space stripped bare of furniture, save for a few rusted metal frames bolted to the floor. High, narrow windows, barred with thick iron, let in slivers of weak, gray light that did little to dispel the gloom. A stale, metallic odor hung heavy, mingling with the pervasive dust. My gaze drifted to the far end of the room, where a series of smaller, cell-like enclosures lined one wall. Each had a heavy, grimy door with a small, sliding panel like a serving hatch. The scraping sound, I realized with a jolt, was coming from inside one of these enclosures. It wasn't a branch, wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, rhythmic, a slow, insistent abrasion against stone. I approached the nearest enclosure, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I slid open the small panel. The scraping stopped. I held my breath, straining my ears, but there was only the sound of my own ragged breathing. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a presence, a breath of frigid air that carried with it an echo of profound, ancient despair. My rational mind, the archivist's mind, struggled to catalog this, to file it away neatly. It could not. This was not a draft. This was not the house settling. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, the taste of ash in my mouth. My gaze swept around the desolate room, taking in the bolted frames, the barred windows, the grim peeling paint. This wasn't a forgotten guest room. This felt like a place of containment, of suffering. This wing of Blackwood Manor, revealed to me in the deepening gloom, was precisely what it felt like, a prison hospital ward at midnight. And some forgotten inhabitant, was still here. My existence in Blackwood Manor had become a peculiar blend of the academic and the unnerving. The initial thrill of discovery, of imposing order on chaos, had begun to fray at the edges, replaced by a persistent, low hum of disquiet. The air itself seemed thicker here, heavy with unseen dust and unspoken histories. Each evening, as the last slivers of daylight receded from the tall, arched windows, the manor exhaled, and I felt its presence more acutely. I had systematically worked through the main library, cataloging the thousands of forgotten volumes. Now my focus had shifted to the smaller, more private studies scattered throughout the upper floors. These were less about grand statements and more about intimate confessions, personal records. It was in the third such study, a cramped space tucked behind a tapestry on the second-floor landing, that I found it. The room smelled of dried lavender and something else, something metallic and faint, like old copper. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of late afternoon sun that pierced the grimy pane, illuminating shelves crammed with obscure texts on heraldry, antiquated maps, and a few leather-bound volumes that looked less like books and more like personal ledgers. My fingers, accustomed to the brittle texture of ancient paper, traced the spines, searching for anything that deviated from the mundane. Behind a false back in one of the deeper shelves, concealed by a row of identical, unassuming almanacs, my fingertips brushed against rough-hewn wood. A hidden compartment. My breath hitched. This was it. This was precisely the kind of secret the manor had been hoarding. With a grunt, I managed to pry open the small panel, revealing not gold or jewels, but a single thick book, bound in dark, almost black leather. It was not a grand tome, but its simplicity, its utter lack of ornamentation, made it feel profoundly significant. I pulled it out, the leather cool and surprisingly supple beneath my touch. It had no title, no author etched into its spine, just smooth, dark hide scarred with age and handling. The brass clasp, tarnished green with oxidation, yielded with a soft click that echoed in the small room. Opening it, I was met with pages of dense, flowing script, handwritten in an ink that had faded to sepia over the centuries. This was a journal, a family journal, my archivist's discipline warred with a primal sense of apprehension. This wasn't merely a document, it felt like a living thing breathing out the accumulated weight of generations. I carried it to the small, rickety desk by the window, careful not to disturb the layers of dust that had settled there. I needed more illumination. A quick search yielded an old oil lamp. I began to read. The early entries were mundane enough, weather observations, notes on crops, social visits. The writing hand changed a few times over the initial pages, indicating it had been passed down. But then the tone shifted. The handwriting, still neat, began to acquire a nervous energy, the lines pressed harder into the page. The entries started to speak of the house, not as a structure, but as a sentient entity. The architect's folly stirs, it demands, a reckoning. A shiver, sharp and sudden, traced a path down my spine. Elias, my great-great-great-grandfather, if my memory of the family tree was accurate. What architect? What folly? Elias's entries became more frequent, more desperate. He spoke of his wife, Martha, growing pale and distant, her eyes fixed on things unseen. Then came the entries that truly stopped me. They were cryptic, almost poetic, yet utterly terrifying in their implication. This wasn't just folklore, this was a personal account, a terrified confession. Elias was describing a ritual, a forbidden ritual. The blood must flow, read an entry from August 12, 1792. Not of the innocent, not of the lamb, but of the one who broke the pact, the true inheritor of the architect's sin. My breath caught in my throat. The words were a physical blow. The oil lamp flickered violently, though there was no draft. A faint, cloying scent like decaying flowers and damp earth wafted through the small study, raising goosebumps on my arms. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, and I, Thomas, the meticulous archivist, was now inextricably bound to it. The game, I realized with a sickening lurch, had already begun, and I was already trapped within its rules. My breath caught in my throat. I looked up, scanning the shadows that danced on and then the shadows were gone. The scent vanished, replaced by something acrid and metallic. The lamp's warm glow evaporated into a harsh, unforgiving glare. My head snapped back, not against the familiar leather of the armchair, but a cold, unyielding surface. My eyes, wide and unfocused, struggled against the sudden, blinding brightness. I was no longer in Blackwood Manor. I was in a prison hospital ward at midnight. The air itself felt thin, scrubbed clean, but still carrying the ghost of sickness and fear. A constant, low hum vibrated through the floor beneath my bare feet, a sound like a distant, overworked generator. Each bed was identical, a thin mattress on a metal frame, separated by flimsy curtains that offered no real privacy. The smell was the worst, a chemical tang of antiseptic mixed with the faint, undeniable odor of stale sweat, fear, and something else. Something cloying and rotten that clung to the back of my throat. A muffled groan echoed from somewhere down the ward, followed by a soft, rhythmic clinking like chain against steel. I tried to move to sit up, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if encased in lead. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I closed my eyes, willing myself back to the study, to the comforting weight of the old tome in my hands. When I opened them again, nothing had changed. A figure stood at the far end of the ward, silhouetted against a grimy window that looked out onto absolute blackness. It was tall, impossibly thin, and utterly still. My breath hitched. It wasn't moving, yet I felt its presence like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. It felt old, ancient, a predatory stillness that seemed to draw all the light and warmth out of the room. It spoke of hunger, of long slumber, of a debt unpaid. A sudden, violent tremor shook the entire ward. The figure at the end of the ward remained motionless, but I could feel it turning towards me, a slow, deliberate shift in its focus. The faint clinking sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by a soft, dragging noise. It was moving towards me. My throat was dry, my voice trapped. I wanted to scream, to tear myself free from whatever unseen bonds held me to this bed. The whisper in my ear intensified, no longer a moth's wing but a rasping breath, promising oblivion, promising an end to everything. The rotten smell was overwhelming now, a stench of grave dirt and something indescribably foul. With a gasping jolt, I was back. The study. The oil lamp still flickering, though less violently now. The familiar scent of old paper and dust, not decaying flowers or antiseptic. My hands were gripping the arms of the leather chair so tightly my knuckles were white. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against bone. Sweat plastered my hair to my forehead, and my shirt clung to my skin. The vision, or whatever it had been, had felt more real than reality itself. The prison hospital ward at midnight. But there was something else, too. That figure, that ancient, hungry presence, it wasn't just a figment of my terrified imagination. It was real, and it was here. It was awake. Driven by a sudden, frantic urgency, I scrambled out of the chair, the heavy book falling to the floor with a dull thud. The pages splayed open, revealing the very passage I had been reading before the shift, a cryptic reference to a chamber of echoes and a blood-bound stone. The words, once obscure, now pulsed with a terrifying significance. The vision had not been random. It had been a warning, a glimpse of what awaited me if I failed. Or perhaps it had been a direct communication. I grabbed the lamp, its light swinging wildly as I moved. My mind raced, piecing together fragments from the journals, the maps, the odd notes I'd unearthed. The Chamber of Echoes. It had to be the hidden room my grandfather had sealed off, the one mentioned in the marginalia of the oldest family tree. A place of forbidden rites. My breath came in ragged gasps as I moved through the manor, no longer careful, no longer methodical. My archivist's precision had been replaced by a primal need to understand, to confront. I passed through the drawing room, its shrouded furniture looming like silent judges, and into the servants' quarters, long abandoned and decaying. The floorboards groaned under my weight, a symphony of decay. I remembered a faint sketch in one of the ledgers, a rough diagram of the manor's foundations, showing an anomaly beneath the old pantry. The pantry which had been walled off decades ago. My grandfather's doing. Reaching the pantry, I found the wall that had been plastered over, seamlessly blending with the surrounding brick. But now, in the lamp's wavering light, I saw it, a faint vertical seam almost invisible where the plaster was slightly discolored, a fraction less aged. It was a door expertly concealed. I pushed, then pulled, then felt along the edges, searching for a latch, a hidden mechanism. My desperation mounted. Then my hand brushed against a small, almost imperceptible protrusion. I pressed it, and with a low, grinding groan, a section of the wall receded inward, revealing a narrow, stone-lined passage. A gust of stale, earthy air, heavy with the scent of stagnant water, and something metallic washed over me. The passage was short, leading to a circular chamber carved directly into the bedrock beneath the manor. The walls were rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture, and covered in crude, ancient symbols scratched deep into the rock face. They weren't like any script I'd ever seen, jagged and unsettling like broken teeth. On the altar, a single object rested, a black, obsidian-like sphere, about the size of a human skull. It pulsed with a faint internal light, a dull, crimson glow that seemed to absorb the lamp's illumination rather than reflect it. It hummed, a low, resonant thrum that I felt more in my teeth than heard with my ears. This was the blood-bound stone. This was the heart of it all. A terrible fascination drew me forward. My legs moved without conscious command, carrying me towards the altar. The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision. My hand, trembling uncontrollably, reached out, drawn by an irresistible force. The moment I touched it, a shock like ice fire shot through my arm, vibrating through every nerve ending. The crimson glow intensified, flaring violently. The humming escalated into a deafening roar that vibrated through the very stone of the chamber, rattling my bones. The archaic symbols on the walls began to glow with the same baleful light, pulsing in unison with the sphere. A guttural, ancient sound, not a voice but a presence, filled the chamber, rising from the very depths of the earth. It was a sound of immense power, of malevolent joy, of an awakening. The ground beneath my feet trembled violently. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling, showering me with dust and small pebbles. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, my heart a frantic, trapped bird in my chest. I had found it, I had touched it, and I had awakened it. The entity, the thing that had haunted my family for generations, was now fully, terrifyingly here. And it knew I was here too. The game had just begun. My eyes, wide and unfocused, struggled against a brutal, fluorescent glare. The air, instead of the familiar must of old paper and dust from Blackwood Manor, was sterile, metallic, and sharp with the tang of disinfectant. My head lay not on the worn leather of my grandfather's armchair, but against a cold, unyielding surface that vibrated faintly with some unseen machinery. I blinked once, twice, my vision slowly resolving the harsh geometry of the room. White walls, too bright, too clean. A narrow cot, not my own bed, bolted to the floor. A steel table with a single dented pitcher. And beyond the bars, a long, echoing corridor lit by the same unforgiving light. A hollow chime, distant and mournful, marked the passing of time. This was a prison hospital ward at midnight. Blackwood Manor, the ritual, what had happened? Where was I? My hands flew to my head, searching for the familiar throbbing, the lingering ache from whatever ordeal had just transpired. There was nothing but the slick dampness of my own skin. I tried to sit up, my muscles screaming in protest, a dull throb blooming in my lower back. The cot creaked, a thin, metallic protest. My gaze swept the small, sparse room, seeking any anchor, any clue. The window was a narrow slit high up, covered by a mesh of thick wire. No view, just an impenetrable rectangle of black. No answer. Only the low hum of unseen ventilation and the occasional, distant clink of metal against metal. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I had been in the library, poring over those crumbling journals. Then this. Was this a dream? A vivid, terrifying nightmare spun from the threads of my escalating fear. I pinched my arm hard. The pain was sharp, immediate, too real for a dream. The isolation was absolute. It felt designed to break a man, to strip away everything familiar until only the stark, unvarnished truth of his predicament remained. But what was my predicament? This wasn't just a sudden change of scenery. This felt deliberate. The entity, had it done this? Had it pulled me from Blackwood Manor, not into some physical location, but into a prison of its own making within my mind? It had been playing with me. Was this the next stage of its game? To convince me I was losing my sanity, that I was trapped not in a manor, but in a place designed for those deemed unstable. The distant chimes sounded again, closer this time, accompanied by a faint scraping sound, like heavy shoes dragging across concrete. My breath hitched. Someone was coming, or something. My eyes darted to the door. The scraping grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural cough. Every nerve ending in my body screamed. A shadow fell across the viewport. Then a face, indistinct in the dim light of the corridor, pressed against the glass. It was broad, flat, with eyes that seemed to swim in their sockets, unfocused and distant. A guard, I presumed, though their uniform was a drab, shapeless gray and their expression utterly blank. They stared for a long moment not at me, but through me, as if I were merely another fixture in the room. I heard the heavy clunk of a latch, then the distinct squeal of a food slot opening at the bottom of the door. A tray slid through with a metallic rattle, a thin, watery broth in a plastic bowl, a piece of dry bread. This was it then. I was here, or I was made to believe I was here. The entity wasn't just haunting the manor, it was haunting me. It was twisting my reality, isolating me from everything I knew, everything I understood. The true horror wasn't the physical confinement, but the insidious, creeping doubt that began to poison my mind. If this wasn't real, what was? Was Blackwood Manor even real? Had any of it been? The guard was gone. I was alone again in this sterile, terrifying cage. The prison hospital ward at midnight was a stage, I realized, set for my personal torment. And the audience was unseen, unheard, but undeniably present, watching me unravel. The chimes echoed once more, marking not time, but my descent. My sanity, meticulous and ordered, was dissolving like sugar in a cup of that watery broth. My head lay not on the worn leather of my grandfather's armchair, but against a thin, unyielding pillow on a cot within what I slowly, agonizingly, recognized as a prison hospital ward at midnight. A low, insistent hum vibrated through the floor, a monotonous counterpoint to the distant clang of metal on metal and the hushed, almost reverent whispers of unseen voices. My tongue felt like sandpaper, my throat raw. I tried to push myself upright, but a dull ache blossomed behind my temples, a throbbing reminder of what? The last thing I remembered was the flickering gaslight in the manor's study, the chill seeping from the walls, the growing sense of an unseen presence. Then a sudden, blinding flash, a ringing in my ears, and nothing. Now this, my gaze drifted across the stark white walls, the single-barred window high above, the metal-framed bed to my right. A thin, coarse blanket covered me. There was a Roman IV drip attached to my arm, a clear fluid slowly making its way into my veins. This wasn't Blackwood. This wasn't even a place I could have imagined myself. The officer. His face was a study in impassivity, eyes like chips of granite. He didn't speak, just observed me with an unnerving stillness. Where am I? My voice was a croak alien to my own ears. The officer remained silent for a long moment, then shifted his weight. You're awake, good. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection. You were found, disoriented, outside a restricted area. Restricted area? Blackwood Manor was isolated, yes, but not. Restricted. How had I gotten here, and more importantly, why? It wasn't just the memory gap, or the strange location. It was the feeling. That familiar, suffocating pressure, the one that had begun to define my days and nights at the manor, was here with me. It clung to the corners of the room, warped the edges of the fluorescent light, made the air feel heavy and thick despite the disinfectant. The manor, I rasped, trying to sit up again. The officer took a step closer, his presence suddenly more menacing. Blackwood Manor, what happened? Manor, he grunted, a flicker of something, perhaps confusion in his eyes. You were found near the old abandoned factory several miles out, rambling, unresponsive. Security brought you in. The abandoned factory, miles from Blackwood. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat. This didn't make sense. It was impossible. I hadn't left the manor. I couldn't have. Not through my ears, but directly into the core of my being. You thought you could leave, Thomas? You thought you could simply walk away. My breath hitched. The officer seemed not to notice, his gaze fixed on some point beyond my head. The entity. It wasn't confined to Blackwood. It was here, with me. The hum of the ward deepened, a low thrum that vibrated through my bones, not from machinery, but from something else, something ancient and hungry. The game has rules, Thomas. You broke the first. You stepped outside the circle. Now you will learn the cost. My eyes darted around the room, searching for a source. A sign, anything. The officer remained impassive. He hadn't heard it. Only I had. The isolation of my experience, the terrifying singularity of it, was almost as horrifying as the words themselves. Then I saw it. On the pristine white wall opposite my bed, faintly at first, then with an undeniable clarity, a single word began to bleed into existence as if etched by an unseen hand. Return. The word shimmered, pulsed with a faint, sickly green light that only I could perceive. It expanded, twisting into a grotesque rendering of Blackwood Manor's decaying facade, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into a perpetual twilight. The entity had followed me. It had allowed me to be found, to be brought here, only to demonstrate its reach, its power. It wasn't a haunting confined to a house. It was a hunter, and I was its prey. The manor is your sanctuary, Thomas, and your prison. You may not leave again. Ritual, that was it. And I, in my naive curiosity, had stumbled into the very heart of it. Try to rest. Rest? How could I rest when I knew that leaving was no longer an option, that my only hope of survival lay in understanding and completing a ritual I knew nothing about? The stakes had just been clarified with terrifying precision. This wasn't just about uncovering family history anymore. This was about my very existence. The prison hospital ward at midnight offered no escape, no solace. It was merely another stage in a game I was forced to play, a game whose rules were being dictated by a malevolent force that transcended brick and mortar, reaching into the deepest corners of my mind. And I knew with a certainty that froze my blood that the next move was mine. I had to return. I had to go back to Blackwood Manor. My eyes snapped open to a different kind of darkness, a less familiar, more sterile black. The last thing I remembered was the cold certainty of Blackwood Manor's dust-laden air, the crushing weight of its secrets. Now, a faint, sickly yellow glow bled from a fixture high above, painting the bare concrete walls in a ghastly pallor. A metallic tang, like old blood mixed with disinfectant, clawed at the back of my throat. I lay on a narrow cot, the thin mattress offering no comfort against the hard frame beneath. My clothes, the same ones I'd worn in the manor, felt foreign, rumpled, and clinging. My head throbbed, a dull ache behind my eyes, and a profound weariness seeped into my bones as if I'd been running for days. The entity had done it again, plucked me from Blackwood and deposited me here, miles away, a pawn in its incomprehensible game. Leaving was no longer an option, not when it could simply relocate me at will. My only hope, the whisper in my mind insisted, lay in understanding. But how could I understand when every answer led to a new, more terrifying question? No, not despair, determination. I would not break. I would not yield. I sat up, my muscles protesting, and swung my legs over the side of the cot. I scanned the room. One door, solid steel, with a small, reinforced window. No other furniture, just the cot and a bolted-down stainless steel toilet in the corner. The air was still and stale, heavy with the scent of forgotten lives. You are alone, Thomas. A voice slithered into my mind, as intimate and unwelcome as a spider crawling across my scalp. "Your struggle is futile. Embrace the truth. Surrender." I clenched my jaw. "No," I muttered aloud, my voice a dry rasp. It wanted me to give up, to stop seeking the truth. That, I realized, was its ultimate demand. To be forgotten, to remain hidden, its power unchallenged. I rose slowly, my joints stiff, and walked to the steel door. The small window, thick with wire mesh, offered a blurred view of a narrow corridor lit by the same sickly yellow light. Empty, utterly deserted, no guards, no other occupants, just an endless, sterile passage stretching into the gloom. I barely recognized the man looking back. As my gaze drifted back to the cot, something snagged my attention. Not a scratch, not graffiti, but a deliberate, crude carving. A twisted knot, a looping, impossible design that seemed to consume itself. My breath hitched. I'd seen it before. Not in a book, not in a diagram, but on the underside of a loose floorboard in my grandfather's study, carved into the raw wood, hidden beneath decades of dust. It was one of the many cryptic markings I discovered in Blackwood Manor, always just out of reach of full comprehension. This was the reveal, a direct, undeniable link. The entity wasn't just dropping me anywhere. It was orchestrating my environment, placing clues, taunting me with its presence. This wasn't a random ward, it was a stage. A small mercy, Thomas, a gift. My eyes narrowed. A gift, a curse. It was a challenge and a clue. The symbol, it had to mean something. It was part of the ritual, I was certain. If I could understand its significance, perhaps I could unravel the entire tapestry of horror my grandfather had woven. I turned from the wall, my mind racing, trying to recall every detail of the symbol from the manor. Was it identical or subtly different? My thoughts were a whirlwind, and the entity seemed to press down on them, trying to scatter them, trying to make me forget. My heart seized. A low, guttural moan echoed from somewhere down the unseen hallway, a sound that wasn't human, a sound that felt ancient and ravenous. It was the event. The entity was escalating. It didn't want me thinking, not now that I had a potential lead. The moan came again, closer this time, followed by a dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the concrete. Panic clawed at my throat, but I forced it down. This was its game. It was trying to scare me, to make me retreat into myself, to surrender to the fear. It knows your name. It knows nothing of me, only what I allow it to know. I closed my eyes, picturing the symbol above the cot, trying to engrave every line, every twist into my memory. This was my fight now, not just for survival, but for understanding. I would not be another victim in Blackwood Manor's bloody history. I would be the one who finally broke the cycle. The dragging sound stopped directly outside my door. I opened my eyes, staring into the impenetrable blackness of the corridor beyond the small window. I wouldn't look away. I wouldn't give it the satisfaction. The game was far from over. The world dissolved around me with a sickening lurch, not a physical fall, but a mental unraveling. One moment I was standing in the dank, earthen cellar of Blackwood Manor, the ancient symbol seared into my mind's eye. The next, the cold, damp air was replaced by a sterile chill that bit at my exposed skin. The smell of mildew and decay was gone, supplanted by the sharp, metallic tang of disinfectant and something else. Something subtly foul and unidentifiable, clinging to the air like a shroud. My eyes fluttered open. Above me, not the rough-hewn beams of the cellar, but a ceiling of chipped industrial white paint, marred by a single flickering fluorescent tube that cast the room in a nauseating, pulsing glow. I lay on a narrow cot, the mattress thin and hard beneath me, covered by a rough, gray blanket that smelled of institutional laundry. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache behind my eyes. I pushed myself up, my muscles stiff, the thin cotton gown I wore rustling with the movement. This wasn't the manor. The walls were bare, painted the same sickly white. A single heavily barred window looked out onto absolute blackness, reflecting only the wavering light of the room. The door, a heavy steel slab, had a small, reinforced viewport, currently dark. A faint, distant wailing echoed through the corridors beyond, a sound that seemed to stretch and distort, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was the sound of something trapped, something suffering, yet also something vast and utterly inhuman in its despair. A shiver traced its way down my spine. This was its doing. The entity hadn't just appeared, it had brought me here into a construct of its own making, a realm designed to strip away my will, to break me before the final confrontation. It fed on fear, on despair, and this place was a crucible of both. I know what I am. I whispered into the oppressive silence, my voice hoarse. My words felt small, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the ward. I closed my eyes, picturing the symbol from the cot in the manor's cellar, the intricate lines and angles that promised both containment and release. The counter-ritual. It was all I had left. It pressed in on me, a suffocating weight that felt like an invisible hand squeezing my chest. A low hum vibrated through the cot, a frequency that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. "I want me to break," snaked through the air, seeming to come from every direction at once. It wasn't words, not precisely, but a cascade of fractured thoughts, of ancient hungers, of the utter emptiness that lay at its core. It spoke of endless night, of forgotten suffering, of the crushing weight of time. It promised a similar oblivion, a peace in surrender. My mind raced, sifting through the texts. The grandfather's journals, the fragmented scraps of knowledge I'd pieced together. The counter-ritual wasn't about banishment in the traditional sense. It was about severing the connection, about sealing the gateway it used to bleed into our world. And the cost. The entity thrived on the resonance of a single, deeply rooted memory, a specific trauma, a lineage of fear. To perform the counter-ritual, I wouldn't just be sealing a physical gateway. I would be severing the emotional tether that bound it to my family, to Blackwood Manor. And that tether, I now understood with a sickening certainty, was woven into my own mind, into the very fabric of my understanding of my family's past. The difficult choice slammed into me, a physical blow. The counter-ritual required me to sacrifice the very memories I had sought to reclaim, the fragments of my grandfather, of my lineage, that I had so painstakingly unearthed. Not just forgetting them, but actively erasing their emotional significance, making them inert, meaningless. It meant becoming truly alone, adrift in a world without anchors. The entity's presence swelled, its unseen laughter a cacophony of scraping metal and dry leaves. It knew. It had always known this was the price. It wanted me to falter, to choose the comfort of my memories, however painful, over the terrifying blank slate of the unknown. I raised my hands, my fingers trembling slightly. I could feel the symbol, the lines and angles etched into my palms as if by fire. The distant wailing outside the door intensified, joined now by a frantic scratching, as if something desperately wanted in or out. "No," I choked out, my voice raw, tears stinging my eyes. The thought of losing those fragile connections, the hints of who my grandfather truly was, the echoes of my own heritage. It was a profound agony. But the alternative was worse. It was the entity winning, consuming everything, leaving nothing but its own endless hunger. I began to trace the symbol in the air, slowly, deliberately, focusing every ounce of my will. The scratching at the steel door grew frantic, desperate, accompanied by a guttural roar. I could feel invisible tendrils lashing out at me, trying to break my concentration, to burrow into my mind and reignite the fear, the doubt. Memories flashed before my eyes, my grandfather's stern gaze, the dusty books in the manor's library, the scent of old paper and forgotten secrets. The entity was throwing them at me, weaponizing my own past, but I pushed through each line of the symbol, a silent declaration of war. The cost was immense, a gaping wound opening in my soul where those memories once resided. It was a wrenching, agonizing sacrifice. The air shimmered, the sterile ward buckling and distorting like a broken mirror. I stood there, gasping, my body shaking, the phantom pain of my loss a dull ache in my chest. The prison hospital ward at midnight still stood, but something had changed. The barred window now showed not blackness, but a faint, gray light, hinting at a dawn that felt impossibly far away. The entity was gone, or at least it was no longer here, no longer connected. But at what cost? I looked down at my hands, the faint glow fading, leaving only the trembling skin of a man who had just traded a piece of his soul for an uncertain victory. And I was left standing in the middle of it, irrevocably changed and utterly alone. The fluorescent glow hummed, a sickly yellow-white pallor that bled into the furthest corners of the prison hospital ward at midnight. It never truly vanished, not even when the guards dimmed the overheads to a perpetual twilight. I lay on the cot, the thin mattress offering little comfort against the hard frame, the rough spun blanket doing even less to ward off the chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. Antiseptic, sharp and acrid, fought a losing battle against the underlying scent of stale sweat and something metallic, something like old blood that had long since dried. My eyes, I knew, were different now. I saw it in the polished steel of the attendant's tray when he brought the tasteless gruel. A hollowness, a deeper shade in the iris like looking into a well at noon. They said I was unresponsive, that my pupils were dilated to pinpricks, then to saucers. They said many things, their voices hushed, their eyes darting away from mine. I heard them even then, the words like pebbles skittering across a vast, empty plain, or perhaps it had merely changed its dwelling. Now it was not around me, but within. Not a voice, not precisely, but a resonance, a low thrumming behind my sternum that sometimes vibrated up into my teeth. It was a constant reminder, a silent pact forged in the crucible of that final, desperate ritual. I remembered the last moments in the manor with a clarity that bordered on agony. The symbols, painstakingly carved into the stone, glowing with an internal, malevolent light. The air, thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something cloying and sweet like decay. My own blood, spilled not in sacrifice, but in a desperate attempt to sever a connection, to close a gate that should never have been opened. I had fought, not with strength, but with a meticulous archivist's precision, following the instructions I had unearthed, each step a gamble against an unknowable force. Did I win? The attendant, a burly man with kind but wary eyes, thought I was broken. The guards, who patrolled the corridor outside my room, their footsteps muffled but distinct, thought I was dangerous. They kept me here away from the general population, away from the world I had once meticulously catalogued. They saw a shell, a vacant stare. They were wrong. The truth was the ritual had worked in a fashion. It had expelled the entity, yes. It had driven it back from the threshold it had so eagerly sought to cross. But a part of it, a sliver of its endless night, had latched onto me, a final, desperate anchor. It wasn't possession, not in the way the old texts described. It was integration, a shard of its perception, an echo of its vast, uncaring knowledge now resided in the quiet corners of my own mind. I could feel the subtle shifts in the air, the way the light truly bent around objects, the infinitesimal vibrations of the building itself. I could sense the currents beneath the earth, the slow, grinding movement of the tectonic plates that held this structure aloft. I could hear the faint, distant cries of creatures that existed beyond the veil of normal hearing, beyond the grasp of common understanding. They were not words, but concepts, raw and unfiltered, pouring into me like icy water. Sometimes, when the ward was at its quietest, when the midnight hour truly settled, I would close my eyes and see Blackwood Manor. Not as it was, crumbling and abandoned, but as it had been, alive with the echoes of generations. But the new Thomas, the one who lay here, tethered to this cot, merely observed. I had tried to explain it once to a visiting official, a woman with a tightly pulled bun and a clipboard clutched like a shield. I spoke of the weave of reality, of the thin places between worlds, of the echoes that lingered after a powerful presence had been banished. She scribbled on her pad, her pen scratching like a beetle across dry leaves. Delusions of grandeur. I imagine, she wrote, paranoid ideation. They believed I had snapped, that the isolation and the inherited trauma had finally unmoored my mind. They were not entirely wrong. My mind was unmoored, but not in the way they understood. It had been stretched, twisted, and then reforged around a terrible, beautiful truth. The world was not as solid as I once believed. The guards changed shifts with a soft jingle of keys, a muted exchange of words. I heard the new guard's heartbeat, a steady thrum against his ribs, and the faint, anxious flutter of a small bird caught somewhere in the ventilation system. I heard the distant, rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet 3 floors below, and beneath it all the omnipresent hum, the entity's lingering song within me. I was no longer Thomas, the meticulous archivist. I was Thomas, the vessel, the accidental gatekeeper. The manor was gone, but its secret lived on, carved not into stone, but into the very fabric of my being. The future was not uncertain. It was terrifyingly clear. I was bound not by chains, but by knowledge. It had merely found a new place to resonate, waiting for the opportune moment, for the thin places to stretch once more. And I was already there.